2019 regular meeting of the Troy Planning Commission. Copies of the agenda for tonight's meeting are available at the entrance to the room. Additionally, the agendas and minutes of prior meetings are available on the city's website. The meeting will be conducted in accordance with the agenda as presented or amended by the Planning Commission. The roles and responsibilities of the Planning Commission are outlined on the reverse side of tonight's agenda. State law establishes planning commissions. The commission is comprised of 9 members, all of whom have volunteered to serve. Members are appointed by the mayor and confirmed by city council. The other individuals seated at the table this evening are representatives of the city's planning department, the city's attorney's office, and the city's planning consultant, Carlisle Workman Associates. If you wish to address the planning commission, please come forward and recognize and provide your name and address on the sign-on sheet. Please begin your remarks by stating your name for the benefit of the commissioners. All remarks are to be addressed to the planning commission, not anyone else in the room. At this time, I ask that all cell phones, Blackberries, PDAs, and any other devices that might disrupt this meeting, please be placed in silent mode or turned off. Mrs. Sarnecki, the roll call, please.
Mr. Aphidian?
Here.
Ms. Cruz? Mr. Faison?
Here.
Ms. Fowler?
Here.
Mr. Hudson? Mr. Krent?
Here.
Mr. Lambert?
Here.
Mr. Rahman?
Here.
Mr. Tago? Mr. Tadapali?
Here.
Did we get notice that Karen and Mike were in attendance? We did. Okay. Nothing. So quorum present.
Definitely for Karen.
Okay, quorum present. Item number 2 on the agenda is approval of tonight's agenda. Can I get a motion to approve tonight's agenda? Mr. Aphidian. And support, Mr.
Give it to Dave.
Mr. Lambert.
Mr. Faison?
Yes.
Ms. Fowler?
Yes.
Mr. Krent?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Rahman?
Yes.
Mr. Aphidian?
Yes.
Motion carries. Item number 3 is approval of the minutes of the June 11th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. If there's no questions or comments, Mr. Lambert.
Just I want to make sure that since we don't have the minutes in front of us, I looked at the one that's on the website, and we have the corrected minutes with notation about that Mr. Rahman and I were patients of MIU and not Mr. Krent, so.
Yeah.
Okay. So that needs to be corrected?
It is corrected already.
Okay, okay. So with that correction, to have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make the motion to approve the minutes.
Mr.
As
Correct.
corrected.
And support? Mr. Roppen? Ms. Sarnecki?
Mr. Faison?
Yes.
Ms.
Oh, no,
Fowler?
I'm sorry. I'm going to abstain.
Ms. Fowler?
Yes.
Mr. Krent?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Rahman?
Yes.
Mr. Aphidian?
Yes.
Motion carries. Item number 4 on the agenda is public comment for items that are not on the agenda. Is there anyone that wants to make a comment on an item that's not on tonight's agenda? Seeing none, we'll go to item number 5. It's a study session, a study item on the topic of transition. So, Mr.
I'll kick it off.
Or Mr. Sadanoff.
So we hear about transition all the time. We're approaching build out. All the vacant farmers fields for the most part have been developed. We're approaching 100% build out. Development that we see today involves typically tear downs and rebuilds or infills. And when there's infill, there's neighbors. When there's neighbors, there's impact. We hear about challenges, relationships, transition between new development and single-family residential all the time. We hear it when there's development on Big Beaver. We hear it when there's development in neighborhood nodes. We hear it when there's cluster developments. That happens when you're approaching build-out. And one of the tenets of our master plan is to protect single-family residential neighborhoods. So there needs to be a balance between new development and existing single-family residential. And tonight's transition discussion is to talk about balance and to talk about transition and issues and whether they are issues. And we're going to have a discussion tonight on transition before we talk about our second item. And I'm handing off to Ben, but I'll chime in and we can all participate in the dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Savanon. So I put together a pretty brief PowerPoint, mostly to introduce the discussion. And really, Brett and I don't report to the expert on this. We're really looking for input from this commission and also input into how we move forward with this. So I've kind of got 6 different discussion points I want to talk about. And the first is successes. So when the master plan was written, it was in a much different time than we are in now. It was recession or right pre-recession, and there were some real strong development goals. And these are just goals in the ordinance regarding development. There's many more goals in that ordinance, but really, the master plan and the zoning ordinance that came from it was really to provide for infill development. As Brent noted, we're a built-out community for the most part. Provide for a mix of housing options. Focus on the corridors and the major mile intersections. Provide for intensity and density in appropriate places. Redevelop Big Beaver and rebound from the recession, and that was what was a major goal.
And just to piggyback on that, remember that the 2008 master plan was the first comprehensive master plan that we had undertaken in over 30 years. It was a significant step, and prior to that, all previous master plans had involved controlling growth. We knew growth was coming, and it was a matter of controlling it because it was rapid and it was rampant. 2008 was a whole different time. So that's why we jumped into some of the issues that Ben just talked about. So it was a paradigm shift in 2008, and completely different way of looking at development, looking at development applications.
So with those being the underlying goals, I think it's really important to highlight some of the successes that we've had, especially since 2011. On Big Beaver alone, we've had 21 new developments. This is an increase of over $35 million in taxable value, not assessed value, but actual taxable value. In other parts of the city, so I basically broke out Big Beaver and then other parts, so the nodes, Rochester Road, Maple, etc. There's been 125 new developments that have been approved by the Planning Commission and or Council. That doesn't mean 125 have actually been built, but 125 have been approved. That's averaging about 14 developments a year. So think about that's you reviewing basically almost one every month, new plans that are being built. The 125, that's a lot of new developments happening in a short period of time. With housing alone, there's been over almost 2,000 housing units have been approved since 2011. That includes 22 new, what I call conventional layouts. Your basically typical subdivision layout. That's 322 units. We've approved 7 cluster developments. That's 210 units. And the big number is this one is multifamily. There's been 13 new multifamily developments been approved for over 1,300 units. That's a significant amount of multifamily that's been developed as well. What this development leads to is increase in taxable value. This is new taxable value, and so in 2011 there was approximately $69 million of new taxable value. That number has increased all the way to $132 million of new taxable value. That's just from new developments. You carry that over into total taxable value for the city. We've increased from approximately $4.4 billion to over $5 billion in 8 years. That's a 14% increase. That's actually higher than the rate of inflation too. So you could argue, and you can see there's actually a big dip here kind of when we're getting out of recession, because typically taxable value lags a little bit farther behind the actual economy, is that the new development has actually greatly increased our taxable value, much more than inflation, simply because by the state of Michigan laws, there's a cap on how much you can increase property value. So the way to get new property value is through development. So what Troy has planned for has happened. We have got the development that we have planned for in the master plan and the zoning ordinance. But the increased development has led to some friction points that we are all aware of. So I wanted to use that to kind of set the stage to talk about these friction points that we are all well aware of. We've identified a few friction points, and I'm sure there's some we've missed, but I want to go over these. The first is, we hear this a lot, is compatibility. We talk about compatibility really in 3 different ways. Use. So it may be single family next to industrial, or single family next to multifamily, or single family next to commercial. Second friction point of compatibility is height. 1 story next to 4 stories, 2 stories next to 4 stories, et cetera. And the third is density, single family detached next to multifamily or next to, maybe next to a cluster, et cetera. So those are kind of the 3 friction points with compatibility. We also hear a lot about friction points with traffic. Both traffic in terms of volume, it's just, this development or X development will bring in X number of more cars. And 2, cut-through traffic. Well, they're going to use my neighborhood now to go through from point A to point B as a result of new development. The third friction point we hear with new development a lot of times is just the street condition. The widths are too narrow to accommodate new development. They're undersized already to begin with, let alone putting on new development on top of it. Lack of sidewalks, ditch, pedestrian safety, conflicts, children, et cetera. We hear that. Bus pickup, bus drop-off, et cetera.
We have hundreds of miles of streets in Troy that are 22 feet wide. Hundreds of miles.
What did we miss? What other friction points have we been hearing?
Well, you hit on all the big ones.
Okay. I'm sure there will be more as we think through this.
Well, the other one I was thinking of is, gobbling up green space. People are always concerned about.
Good one, yeah.
That was a stimulus of our woodland protection efforts and our cluster efforts, was hearing that. Very common theme.
Another one that's been brought up is school capacity.
Mhm. And we got a letter from the Troy School District related to that I shared with the Plan Commission. I asked them to prepare the letter, and they did.
So, and I'm really talking more about this issue of transition, about between those friction points where there's different types of land uses. And how does the master plan speak to it? Well, you've seen this graphic 1,000 times. Transition of intensity, both in height and use, directly in front of Big Beaver and those adjacent, should scale down, right? So more intensity, more height, more density on Big Beaver, and you scale back. But one of the conversations we just had with the chairman is planning and development doesn't work linear all the time. It's not a perfect world. You don't go from A to B to C. Sometimes you go from B to C to A. And so there are some questions about, does this need to happen first before this happens? And that's some constant conversation that this commission and this council has been struggling with. But both the master plan and zoning ordinance talk about that a tenet of the ordinance is the protection of single-family residential or residential properties. That is a fundamental key of what the zoning ordinance and master plan is intended to achieve. So how does the zoning ordinance talk about that? Well, in the form-based district, we actually have a specific or a dedicated section just of transitional features, and there's 5 standards that talk about this. These can be somewhat subjective, though. You can basically interpret these how you will for every development. So there is a little bit of wiggle room with some of these features and transitional features of the ordinance. In addition, we added these design standards into the site plan review process. This was done a year ago. I think it was about a year ago we adopted
Yes.
these. That when we review developments that go through site plan review process, we'll use these standards as well as to ensure compatibility. And again, these are all reviewed on a case-by-case basis as development occurs. With regards to location, the areas that we've talked about the most, that we see the most of this friction is really along Big Beaver for the most part, and predominantly along the north side of Big Beaver. As you can see, these are the direct areas where Big Beaver zoning directly abuts single-family residential. There's only a really small pocket on the south side where it directly abuts, but again, there's a road in between. But these are these blue circles are the areas where you actually have abutting zoning. You get next to each other. We have not got as much development in the neighborhood node as we may have anticipated or desired, but it's worth noting that we have 21 nodes, neighborhood nodes in the city, and 20 of them directly abut single-family residential. The only one that doesn't is this, and I believe it does abut in adjacent communities, but it doesn't abut in Troy, so I'm not going to count it.
Let's pause on this real quick. Comment pointer. So those of you who were on the Plan Commission in 2008, we proposed a new node at this intersection. This is Crooks and Waddles. I think, Tom, were you on the planning commission
Not
then?
yet. Almost. I attended a few of the meetings, but
Okay.
I wasn't.
Okay, so I guess none of you who are here tonight were on the planning commission. So this was an undeveloped corner essentially, and we proposed this as a node, recognizing that there really weren't a lot of commercial options for people that live over here. They had to go basically across 75 and go over Rochester Road, or live in Rochester Road for any type of convenience shopping or that type of thing. So we determined that this would be a node. And this actually delayed the master plan by a number of weeks because we postponed it because some residents and property owners got involved. But now there's a 7-Eleven, so we master planned it for node, we zoned it node, and there's a 7-Eleven on the corner, there's an office below that, and as of last week, there's a application for residential attached multifamily residential here. We'll be seeing that soon. Transition, right? It's gonna abut single-family residential. 2.5 stories next to single-family residential.
Can I ask you a question about
Yes.
those nodes? And the one I'm talking about specifically is the one at the Renoyan Square Lake. And I asked you about it before, and it just seemed like it was out of place when they put in those multifamily, their apartments or condos.
43 condos.
Okay, so why was it determined that the development in those nodes could be so high? I mean, I was told that, well, it could have been 5 stories. Why are the nodes allowed to be so high?
Because there's a number of reasons, but the master plan has identified, and demographics back it up, that there's a lack of a wide range of housing opportunities across the board in the city of Troy. And one of the types of housing that's lacking, if you look at a population of 80,000 and 30,000+ properties, is that attached product. So recognizing that we needed that type of housing option in the city, they've got to go somewhere. So it made the most sense to be the least disruptive, to put them at the 21 intersections, major mile road intersections throughout the city.
I mean, I guess it just is aesthetically totally out of place.
Yeah.
It doesn't, to me, totally inappropriate. And you have all those condominiums, et cetera, up and down Rochester Road. I mean, there are a ton of multifamily developments in the city of Troy. And when you go down, I always look at the Amber Apartments, they're all right, but that's another one. The ones right here in town center that look out of place. I think you have to look at the aesthetics, not just look at, whether or not that development is needed somewhere, and it just doesn't fit.
So you're not the only person who has that opinion. There's a member of the audience, I think, who would agree with you. I disagree with both of you. I think it is appropriate. That's only my opinion, though, and I'm entitled to my opinion just as you two are entitled to yours. I've heard both. I've heard people have come by my counter and told me that they hate it, and people have come by my counter and told me that they love it. So you're not the only one who's told me that.
I guess my other question would be, why were they allowed to be so close to the sidewalk?
Yeah, it was actually required.
I know, but that doesn't make sense to me either.
Yeah, so what we're trying to accomplish with nodes is there's the master plan was a process that we entered into. We started in about 2006, and that was following a public engagement process. Tom, remind me what we call that. Visioning, Vision 2020. I drew a blank there. Vision 2020, where hundreds and hundreds of residents got involved in coming up with a vision for Troy. Mr. Lambert, I'm sure you were involved in that. A vision for the city of Troy moving forward. And one of the concepts for the visioning was creating and strengthening sense of place. And we looked at opportunities for creating and strengthening sense of place throughout the city, and it seemed to make the most sense to do it at these intersections, where we could get away from being somewhat of a regional type place where you went to the large shopping centers and large malls, where you could address some of your needs at these intersections locally instead of having to go regionally. So that was an opportunity, and to get there, we felt that rather than have these new buildings and these new uses set back from the road, we wanted them on the road where there's a presence, where they could help create place versus dealing with vacant parking lots. So it was really to strengthen the relationship between the new buildings and the new uses and the streets to create place.
Is there any, like, a diameter limitation, like how far you can go?
I've taken over the conversation here, Ben. So the master plan, we call these blobs, these circles, and they're actually, what Ben did here when he put this excellent graphic together was that he used the zoning map as the layer and to kind of represent the scale, the scope of the nodes. But in the master plan document, the circles are all the same size. So we call them blobs. So it was conceptually show that there was going to be this investment at the corners. But that was only a concept, a policy as part of the master plan. We then had to implement that policy through a zoning ordinance, which is a law. So you've got to go parcel by parcel. So what the Planning Commission did with these 21 intersections is we went corner by corner, identifying where those actual property boundaries should be. So some of the nodes are larger than other nodes because getting back to protection of single-family residential property values. For all the nodes except the one in the southeast corner, there's people that live nearby. So we wanted to create nodes that were large enough to make a statement and to create place, but not so large that they disrupted existing neighborhoods. So a lot of the time, for the most part, where that boundary line should be was very intuitive. It made sense. For some of them, we went kind of butted heads as a board to come up with appropriate locations for those boundaries.
I'm sorry.
I was going to have there been development at all the nodes?
No. No, to be honest, we haven't had the amount of development that we thought we would have with the nodes because they're very inclusive in terms of the range of uses permitted. But there are still people developers in the community or in the area that are uncomfortable with the notion of bringing the building closer to the street. They like the parking in front of the building, for the most part.
So Brent, did the zoning actually change? So the zoning changed, did you have any of these, since the zoning changed, have any of the nodes been expanded? I know we tried to expand for that easy storage that failed. That was going to be an expansion of the
It did
node.
expand because there was a rezoning to allow multifamily. The Robertson brothers.
Okay, so that is,
There's been a
okay.
couple
Yeah.
expansions of the node.
Okay, and then was the Livernois Haldane project that Ms. Fowler is referring to?
That was an expansion.
of
Yes,
the
it was.
neighborhood node? Okay.
So we allowed to expand, right?
Yep.
So
It's
it can grow.
Through
It goes over
rezonings,
time.
through
rezoning,
rezoning, so
of course, it has to be.
which goes before planning commission for recommendation, then goes to city council as legislative decision, because we're changing the law, and every property owner within 300 feet is notified, so they have a chance to participate in the process.
That will be the next property, or it doesn't matter. Like if there is a node, right? So that the budding property can only apply for.
Yeah, so if I can phrase your question another way, if someone wanted to, if there was a developer who really liked the provisions in the node, they could expand the node, so they could take the existing node and make it larger, but they couldn't leapfrog a single-family residential property and have a standalone node.
Okay, thank
By
you.
definition, a node has to be attached to that corner. We've had plenty of developers ask that, if they can leapfrog.
Right.
And start a node a quarter mile away. No.
So it has to grow.
Has to
one by
grow,
one.
yes. Well, that's a good way of putting it. Has to grow. I think so.
All right, so
I have one more question. If I look at the population of the city of Troy, it didn't significantly change, right? So I cannot balance the equation, like why we need so many, what's happening? Do you have any idea?
Housing needs have changed.
Well, it's our demographics are consistent with the rest of the country. Smaller families, children younger people are choosing not to get married, not to have families, or if they do, they're very small families. So this is a trend. So there's still a need for new homes because we still have a population that wants to be in Troy for various reasons, but we've also got demographics who are looking for different alternative housing
So I said
options.
more families, but smaller families. Maybe the answer. So
Yes, that's part of it.
Yes.
The number of households have gone up, but they're much smaller, so
Smaller
so
families.
total
So,
population
like,
is pretty, it stays.
number of people in one house is fewer.
Yes.
But that, because if you look at like 15 years, 20 years ago, 80,000, I think something like that, it's still 80,000 or something. So, I mean, I see that there are like, you showed like 1,300 something new properties were
Yep.
built.
Yep. And that could be attracting a different demographic that hasn't had the opportunity to live in Troy in the past, because that type of unit that they wanted wasn't here.
Do you foresee like a huge increase in population?
No, I tend to agree with the literature that's out there that's indicating that in the next about 15 years, we're going to have a dramatic oversupply of large single-family residential homes. We're going to have people who aren't going to be able to sell their homes. They're not going to have a buyer. Just because the baby boom population, it's this tsunami that's aging rapidly, and then you're going to have tens of millions of people who are wanting to sell their home at the same time, and you're not going to have tens of millions of buyers. That's happening as we sit here. It's approaching. I don't want to go doom and gloom, but that's the census.
Call my realtor.
Yeah.
I mean, the literature's out there.
You can wait, rather wait.
Sorry.
How are the schools going to be affected then? Since for population-wise, if that's going to go up in the years coming.
What's going to go up? I'm sorry.
The population in Troy, if there's more households coming, isn't that
But they're smaller.
going to be smaller, right?
Smaller households.
The schools are kind of leveled off.
Yeah, I was going to defer to you. I'm glad you jumped in there.
Yeah, they've kind of leveled off.
Yeah, we're lucky to have an in-house expert on on schools.
All right.
So we kind of identified successes and locations and I would say friction points, and now I'm going to bring up some solutions. Now these are just some preliminary solutions. I don't expect consensus or commitment tonight, but just something to get people thinking. First solution is amend the master plan. Take out those areas that are adjacent to Big Beaver in those friction points. Take out the node areas. These are, you can see this is the master plan, this is a node area. You'll know, especially the friction point we talk about this in the McClure and Alpine area, the actual designation line of the master plan for the Big Beaver zoning is much further north of Big Beaver than the actual zoning is. It's about 4 or 5, 6 parcels farther north. So one solution is we don't get this conflict. Well, the master plan says it should be Big Beaver, but we don't support necessarily the rezoning of Big Beaver, is take it out of the master plan. Same for the nodes. If there are area nodes that they're potential to take those nodes out of the master plan.
Just a question on that. So you say take the areas out of Big Beaver. Does that eliminate the friction, or does it just move the friction point to a different?
Probably moves it a little bit further south
Right.
on a lot of them. But it takes, it does, it would take out, what it would do, it would be take out those properties that are not currently zoned Big Beaver, but master plan Big Beaver, and put them back to master plan to single family, which they're currently zoned. Hence, it would be a much harder accomplishment to rezone the Big Beaver, which is not supported by the master plan. But there are unintended consequences with that, like you said. It probably maybe move things further south.
Okay.
We are not saying we endorse any of these. We are just simply bringing them out for discussion. Zoning regulations. You should have a height to setback ratio. So essentially, the higher the building, the greater the setback. So a 2-story building, the setback is, let's just say, 50 feet. If you do a 4-story building, the setback from residential would be 100 feet. It's a pretty standard universal zoning tool. Do what we call the wedding cake. The taller the building, the more it steps back from residential. So the 2nd story is set here, 3rd story moves back, 4th story moves back, and it's kind of like a wedding cake. As it goes up, it moves in. Simply cap height next to single family. You can only be 3 stories, 4 stories, whatever that number is.
Can I share our conversation that we had about height on nodes? We talked on the phone a couple months ago, and you've referenced it in our conversation earlier this evening, 5 stories for the neighborhood nodes is the maximum height. Should we rethink that? Should it be 3 stories? Barb would agree that it should be 3 versus 5.
I was surprised.
Yeah.
Very surprised. You said it could have been 5.
Yeah, and I think, so,
Or, let me just jump on,
Yeah.
or 3 stories adjacent to residential, but 4 stories when you're not adjacent to residential. I mean, there's a lot of ways to cook this cake.
yeah, and I go back to 2008 when it was a different time, and we were looking to stimulate investment, appropriate investment, and get these new housing opportunities and get this investment and create sense of place. We were looking at ways, because Kathy would remember this. There was a couple of years where there was nothing going on, and property values plummeted. Industrial property had dramatic vacancy rates, and office dramatic vacancy rates. House values crashed. I mean, it was a dark time, and we were looking at ways to right the ship, and that was the approach we took. Now that it's 2019 and we're 8 years from our revised zoning ordinance, is it time to tweak? I don't know. That's what we're here to talk about tonight.
So follow-up question on that project, because I thought you said it was a rezoning. So did we have the ability to approve something different than what was actually built? Or was it a by right development?
The one at Livernois and Square Lake?
The project we're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, so that one, the frontage of that was neighborhood node, and there was a portion at the back that was zoned RT, 2-family attached. And they, LD, yes. And they've voluntarily submitted a site plan that had conditions, and they proposed, at the time, I think it was a 45 unit, and they took a couple of units out and did some things. But yeah, it was, the back portion of that was rezoned to neighborhood node.
But the back portion is the one that abuts the residential, and
yes.
the one that's the issue, and that could have been dealt with the site plan. It
Yeah,
sounds like.
that, although that residential was RT, was duplexes. It wasn't single-family detached, it was single-family duplex. But what they did was, they reduced the height of the units. No, they pushed them further back. They increased, go back to that diagram, the other one, this one, they pushed it back further to have a better relationship with the duplexes behind it.
I guess the point I'm making is that it seemed like there was flexibility that the planning commission had when the project came to have these kind of adjustments.
Insofar as the developer voluntarily revised the site plan application, it's not a flexibility relationship where we can say, hey, you should do this, and it's not a back and forth, because it has to be voluntarily offered. So it becomes very awkward.
But the answer
But
is,
you can decline.
yes,
Right,
you say it does not meet the standards
Right.
because it's impact.
Exactly.
Yes.
So there is that, yes. All right, so cap height on adjacent single-family residential. Increase the buffer landscape requirements. We now have a 10-foot landscape buffer, and within that, when you have 2 what we call incompatible land uses, we'll use that for lack of a better term, you have to do so much landscape screening, and it's 1 row of evergreen. Maybe we should increase it to 20 feet or 30 feet, and more evergreen screener, et cetera. So increase landscape buffer requirements. Or do nothing. We're getting what we planned for. I think that's it. Oh, did we miss anything?
The only problem is we're getting what we planned for. That's a lot of pushback from the community. So I don't know if, that's the one thing I noticed, the buffer, being 10 feet or some other, when the Monarch project was being proposed, City Council passed in their resolution that they actually had to buy up another complete 2 lots to make that a parkland that will be maintained by the developer, not the city. So there was, that's a 120-foot buffer of just green space open, and they were supposed to actually put park benches and other things. It was supposed to be more of a community gathering point for both the new development and existing residents. So that kind of a buffer was actually, there was not a big pushback on that. That was kind of like, oh, okay, so we've got some green open space between us and this more dense, but what we're seeing now is, 10 foot and a wall. It's like, no, that's not enough. I think there's got to be a bigger buffer between a low density area and a high density area.
Where exactly are you speaking about?
This is in my neighborhood. It's on Big Beaver, the PUD on Big Beaver, but the two sides of it were McClure and Alpine.
Right.
Yeah.
That was a 25-story building, a 19-story building.
Yeah, correct. I think they reduced it slightly at the end, though. Those are the original. I think it ended up with 23 and 12.
Okay.
But
Plus
that had to
townhomes
do
behind.
that. Yes, they had three or four story. I think it was 4 for the most part, but I think the last ones they may have toned it down to a 3-story. But that said, the overall height came down because of the whatever the Commission for Airlines, FAA. Thank you. They said it was too tall for their landing to the airport. But that was the thing that moved it down a little bit from that original.
And this was in 2008.
8. Yeah.
And they spent $650,000 for those two houses in 2008.
Yeah. Well, I kind of added up. My math might be not perfect, but I added up all the things they purchased, including, well, they had to buy frontage on Big Beaver, which was not cheap. But the total of the 6 residential lots plus the commercial or office or whatever it was zoned before, that total around 7.5 million. I don't know what they sold it for, but I thought it was around 2.5. So it was a $5 million difference. That's a write-off.
So Ben, one of the things you talked about that I think is interesting, and I think we talk about it on the individual projects, is the height of the building that abuts the single-family residential. So potentially limiting that building right there at that point, and then the transition going from there.
So not the wedding cake, but the actual physical building set, like the foundation setback. So because there's 2 ways.
Yeah.
They're showing it. Literally, the first floor is X amount of feet, based on the height, and the second one is, as the stories go up, then it starts being pushed back.
Yeah, I think that's one. I think both are viable, but I think I was talking more about that one, this one, the wedding cake.
I think we talk about it setting back or not. I mean, for me, I don't want parking in that setback. I want some kind of buffer and get a setback, but not parking, so that the parking is right at the road.
So the challenge we have with the nodes, and you could make an argument for some of the other districts, but particularly the nodes, is there's not a lot of area. So there's not simply isn't a lot of distance to have that big setback. So if we're going to allow the 5-story buildings and that setback, we're simply not going to get it. We're not going to get it.
Well, some of these developments that came before us, they're not just one building, right? So that's the challenge. You got multiple buildings, so the question is, like Mr. Faison put it, the building closest adjacent to the residential property, but it's not just one building. So then would it be the building closest, and then we can work our way up in that transition? So there are so many, many variations that you can have there, because you can't, most of the developments we've seen and some of the more contentious locations, they weren't just one building.
Right. Let's pretend this was not here and these were 2 separate buildings. You could still have the same regulations where 2 buildings could act as, lower in front, higher in the back.
I want to make a comment about the nodes. The nodes, originally, the whole idea, I believe, of the nodes, correct me if I'm wrong, was to get, to encourage more walkable, so that when someone needed to go shopping, they could walk the half mile. I can't remember the stats that you put out, but it was, a half mile was about it, a quarter mile, whatever the distance was. If they're gonna walk a mile, they're not gonna do it, they're gonna get in the car. So that said, or, you know, kids on a bike, you know, as a child, that's what I did. We had these baskets on the bike, and it was about roughly a half mile from our house to 7 Mile Road, where all the shopping was, and I could take the bike, go down, get some groceries, you know, bring them home. That's the intent of the nodes, but I'm just looking at how, other than at 7-Eleven, which is, you know, fits in that category of, you know, I can ride my bike and pick up, you know, some milk or bread or whatever. Some of those other nodes, or the buildings being proposed for those nodes, are not necessarily a shopping type thing. Sometimes you got dental office, you got whatever. And I'm just wondering, how do we tweak the node requirements to make it more of what we originally intended, which was more walkable, bikeable community?
More retail.
More retail, correct, yeah.
Well, one of the ways is to have people reside in the nodes and be able to walk. So we got the recent one, the Robertson Brothers one, the name escapes me, but it's at Long Lake and Livernois.
Correct, yep.
On the south side of Long Lake. That's one. We have the
Yes.
one we've talked about at Livernois and Square Lake. The one I mentioned, that's being proposed. We just got the application at Waddles and Crooks, and we're having developers kick tires in other intersections. So it's taken a while for the development community to recognize the need for these we've but now that we've had one constructed and we had another one approved, and there's been a certain degree of success from an application standpoint, we'll see more of these. So it's a lot easier to walk to the corner when you live 100 feet away.
Sure.
But I think one of the maybe one of the things I'm taking away from your point. So I live near that node at Waddles and Crooks, right? So there's a 7-Eleven there, but then there's like the medical office building. So I don't know if anybody's going to be walking to that. I don't know if you
Probably
were
not.
talking about that, and that should
Probably
be
not, because they're gonna come
more
from a further
destination retail that you can create a walkable pocket. So was that the intent, or was it to be mixed, where like you got retail and that office type building?
It was to achieve all those things and let the market kind of determine what should be there and provide flexibility. You know, ultimately, well, I should have mentioned walkability when I was answering your question about why the node concept. That's a very critical.
I think you did actually.
Okay, it's a critical element, but we took a market-driven approach to the zoning ordinance. We wanted the market, as long as it was appropriate, the market to kind of determine what was going to be developed, and we wanted flexibility at the same time, and we wanted to ensure that we had standards related to transparency and building placement and quality materials and these types of things.
And to a great extent, that's happening. You know, it used to be at every node, there was a gas station, or two, or even four.
Yeah.
And look at even Big Beaver and Crooks. That, where the Starbucks is now, it's a gathering place. It used to be a gas station. So again, getting away from auto-centric to more of a walkable, that was accomplished. Although it's a tight, busy, congested place, that's what transitioned at that corner.
I mean, mind you, we're only really 8 years, 10 years into the life cycle of this master plan zoning ordinance, and development takes, to achieve this takes years. So I keep getting back to thought we have done a really good job of building, of achieving what was intended in the master plan. And you're right, the nodes are really intended to be market-based, and that's what we've got. Residential right now it's the #1 development anywhere in Southeast Michigan. And that's what we're getting at the nodes right now. Everyone wants a coffee shop and a bookstore right next to their house. Right now, those aren't being built.
We're focusing on...
To get those lag behind rooftops. They literally count rooftops to achieve those types of development. So you get the critical mass around the nodes, you're more likely to achieve those retails that can be supported by those rooftops. So that lags behind the residential.
we're focusing the last few minutes on nodes, but if you look at Big Beaver, the influx of apartments, a lot of those apartments are on Big Beaver. But you look at what's happening on the other side of 75 with all the dramatic retail and restaurant, with the parking deck, there's going to be a 270-unit apartment building next to that parking deck. Those are going to be 270 apartment dwellers at least, who are going to be able to walk to restaurants, to coffee shops, to places of work.
Yeah, that's right in a node. I mean, that's at Crooks and Big Beaver.
Yeah, it's not a node, it's Big Beaver, but it's a
Yeah, I
form-based,
understand.
it's a form-based district
Right.
where we will achieve walkability on Big
Right.
Beaver. Who knew? 20 years ago, that was a foreign concept. It's happening.
So just to piggyback a little bit on going back to the node idea. So if our intent here is to be market driven, right? We noticed that there's a lag in the market from when the nodes were actually implemented and established, and we actually didn't get the result that we were looking for when they were initially established, and just finally the developers are really, trying to mitigate that risk more than a decade later, and saying we're willing to take that risk in a node. My question is, the fundamental question is, if the market is finally catching up more than a decade later, why even consider eliminating the nodes if we're just barely starting to get that development in the nodes, right? We don't even, it hasn't been anywhere to the scale of what we've seen on Big Beaver. So, I think that's a question we should ask. If we're just barely starting with the nodes, maybe we have another decade to even see what even the potential is on those nodes.
And this could be the time to lower the
The
height.
height. This is what
There's
it's
a lot
not
of
being
those nodes. Because since they haven't really reached the development, if you're really going to continue with the nodes, then maybe it's time to review what's allowed in the nodes.
Right, but even with the permitted height, market-driven, we've never seen a five-story multifamily development, even by
Even the-
even
it's not
permitted,
in the nodes.
permitted in the
But
nodes.
when you talk about
Right.
transition, it's hard to believe that you want a five-story.
Right, so
Because those are close to
yeah.
residential areas.
I think it comes back to the fundamental or philosophical question that if we allow these developments to be market-driven, then similarly to what we did with the cluster ordinance, we should let the market dictate what actually can occur at that corner or that node. And if the market study won't permit a five-story development, for sure the developer will not put a five-story development
What
in
if
it.
it did, and then you still have those residential areas?
I guess that's speculative based on the project we've seen so far. It seems like the sweet spot of these multifamily units is that three-story, like similar to the development that we've seen there, the development that we've seen up on Rochester and Long Lake. That,
What
yeah.
has happened to that Robinson one? They came to us and we said, we went right next to, it's right on Long Lake by Trevaro there.
It was
They went
approved.
back-
It
approved.
Oh, it was approved, so I missed that meeting.
Yeah, when you saw the meeting, we had some, the planning commission postponed it with a lot of suggestions. They incorporated every suggestion, significantly improved the layout.
Oh, I missed those minutes.
Yeah,
Okay,
It went to council.
it went to council, unanimously approved.
okay.
Sorry, Mr. Tatterbilly.
I think for the, future-wise for Troy, Big Beaver have more businesses, but we had our recent, I think a few weeks back, or maybe 2 months back, we had our Moderate Properties, Troy School District, doing something with nature and homes, so we're conserving land. I think we could work with, Stage Nature Center and other places where we could conserve land and build houses, because sometimes we have congested areas, again, even though we have green space, we could have more, in my opinion, so.
Thank you. How tall were the buildings in the Robinson development? Did they adjust the height there? I know they changed the layout, and I thought they took out some units as
They took out units more open space. I think they were
30.
30 foot,
I think, yeah, they weren't
32,
30.
30-ish.
Yeah,
3 stories,
Okay.
30 feet.
Okay.
I don't believe we've seen any, have we seen 4-story residential? I don't think we've seen 4-story residential products right now.
not right now.
And then the Haldane project is that 3 stories or 4 stories? 3 stories?
I'm gonna go back, talking about friction points. And one friction point I see, 'cause I just happen to be alerted to something in my subdivision, because they put some information out on our subdivision Facebook page about a development that I guess is coming in front of us in a couple of weeks over at Willow Grove and Square Lake, is the concept, believe that, number one, the only reason property is being developed is because it helps the tax base for the city, and that's the only reason development is occurring, and also a misconception about private property rights, the fact that if something is zoned for residential, the developer has the right to develop it regardless of whether we say you can do that or you can't do it. So I think that might be something that we need to talk about, is how do we educate the public about the whole concept of development and why it's being done, why it's not being done.
I think we've tried to do that. I know we adjusted the presentation to talk about what's by right, what we have the ability to opine on. So, but I do think that's correct, that we continue to need to educate the public on what the developer is actually able to do by right.
Yeah, and I think actually both Ben and Brent have, especially on more contentious things, have did a little preliminary to the audience of the zoning and the master plan ahead of time before the presentation from the developer, so that the audience had a better understanding right off of what is allowed and what isn't, allowed. I thought that's a nice add-on that we've had in the last few years that we didn't have maybe 5-6 years ago. It's nice to have that.
I think one thing that we've seen, especially in Big Beaver, in terms of friction point, is kind of like the gray area, that we don't have the Big Beaver district, that boundaries very well defined, right? So that creates a friction where today it can be here, tomorrow it can be, we will move it and rezone it another 100 feet into the residential neighborhood.
The Big Beaver zoning.
The Big Beaver zoning
line.
The zone line.
Doesn't match the master plan.
Correct. That's one of the
So
points
so
you
that's
made,
created,
right?
that's created that tension from the residents' perspective, the owners who actually abut to that, and also from a developer's perspective, because they wanted that clear definition that this is where Big Beaver is, and this is where I'd like to plan and mitigate my risk by basing my project on master plan. So if we define that boundary more clearly, I think it would be a win-win for the community, for the developers, and for the residents, and not leave it into that gray zone.
I agree.
And that was
So-
done because they couldn't agree? Is that why it was done that way?
It was, this is going to be a long-winded answer. So,
Be careful.
yeah, I need to be careful. Maybe I should punt on this response. What do you think?
I mean, I anticipate a lawsuit, and I'd rather not.
I think that's probably a conversation for another time.
It's not unusual, so.
Yeah, let's speak in generalities.
So in generalities, it's not unusual
Yeah.
when you adopt a master plan and you adopt a future land use one, especially one as different as what this was as compared to what you had previously, that you don't always rezone every single property at that point. One, for a couple of reasons. One is because a lot of times doing that will, you'll wash the baby out with the bathwater. You'll never pass it because everyone can't agree on that. That's the first. Two is because oftentimes you want to handle those rezonings on a case-by-case basis, and that's what you use the master plan for, is to interpret that. So there are always going to be areas where the master plan line doesn't always match the zoning line, and that's okay. It doesn't have to always match, because it allows some flexibility for yourself and the city council to make determinations on what's the best care, based on the context of the area, etc. It's okay to have some discrepancy between those two, and I think you need to be really careful about drawing that master plan line, literally a line in the sand on a map, parcel by parcel. I think you want the flexibility, especially in those transition areas, to understand context and review these on a case-by-case basis, because you don't necessarily want to lock yourself into a line in the sand on those issues. We've gone away from this, to be perfectly honest, and most master plans we do now, we've gone away from this line. We talk more about character, and we talk more about these transitional issues. So we actually have more of a kind of a bubbly kind of map where you can't get down to the parcel level. It allows flexibility for the city to make case-by-case determinations to really have it in context with the surrounding area. So I would be really careful if we went back, started amending the master plan to move those lines along because of the issues I just noted. And it's okay to have a little bit of differences between the two.
And then there's embedded friction in that scenario.
Well, I would argue that we may never come to any consensus in this community about where that line should be.
Right.
So then it's up to the representatives of the community to make those kind of decisions. Council?
Yes.
Based on input from the public, based on input from
Right.
your staff, based on the planning commission's public hearing, et cetera. And that's how this,
So master plan is more like a guideline.
it's a policy document.
It's a policy, like, that's the way we see. But the zoning ordinance is more like, right?
So the master plan is the policy document that defines the vision for the community in the
Right.
future. But it's a policy document. It's implemented through the zoning ordinance, which is law. The zoning ordinance is based on that policy
Right.
document.
Zoning ordinance supersedes, so that's right?
Well, they're related, so I wouldn't say supersedes. Zoning is law, and any decision that's made related to zoning is required by law to be based on the master plan. So the first thing you do for every decision related to zoning is look at the master plan to verify that it's consistent with your vision.
So
But unless you are
there's-
rezoning, then it's law, right?
Well, the first thing you'll do, if you look at any report that we make at the planning commission meeting when we have a rezoning, the first thing we do is we talk about the master plan and what the master plan calls for that area.
But if it is not rezoning, existing zoning, then that's the right? The person who owns that parcel can do whatever they want
Yeah,
to do, based on the current zoning.
The property.
Even it falls in the master plan.
Yeah, every property that's zoned has rights. And those are by right developments, so things that you can do by right under that existing zoning ordinance, those are very strong rights that property owners have.
Right.
The key, what we try to do with the zoning ordinance is strike a balance. We try to strike a balance between the rights of the property owner who wants to develop his or her property with the rights of the surrounding properties that are potentially impacted. How do you find that balance? Well, you do it through setbacks and height limitations, things like that. Site plan review standards.
So just a clarifying question on that. So then if we were to take the circles out, right, or conform the master plan to the existing zoning, then those properties in that bubble, you wouldn't be able to rezone them?
You could, but then it would be contrary to the master plan.
Which would seem to be an inconsistent
Yeah.
approach to take.
I also want to
So-
note, I'm sorry.
So this gives you the flexibility to make a decision
Based on-
in those areas, yeah.
I also one thing I always want to stress about the master plan too is remember, this is one page of a 350-page document. So we always get caught up, well, if it's a red line, if it says Big Beaver, it has to, no, I mean, there's other goals and there's other strategies and actions and concepts in that master plan that may be somewhat contrary to that individual parcel being highlighted as Big Beaver. So you have to take the entire context of the 350 pages when you make these determinations. And we try to do that for you. We try to help you make those. And if we're not doing a good enough job, please let us know. But I also want to make sure that we just don't get hung up on one page of the document. It's a long document that's very complex.
And it's, like I mentioned, these are blobs. These are not parcel by parcel, they're conceptual blobs that are intended to simplify concepts, land use concepts. So if it looks really simplistic, kind of rudimentary, it's meant to look that way. It's not lot by lot. It's trying to summarize a 300-page document in one sheet of paper. It's very difficult.
So hypothetically, if we remove all the nodes, what do those parcels go back to, what zoning?
We'd have to make a decision as a group.
Okay, so,
Yeah,
so,
and
so
ultimately,
it'd be a new zone, I mean, it'd be something that doesn't
be-
exist today, not necessarily what it existed prior to them becoming neighborhood node, right? I mean, it'll be something.
We would have to go parcel by parcel, node by node, and rezone all of them back to or zone to something
Okay.
different than node.
So the intent of this conversation was to stimulate thought. It wasn't to arrive at any decisions this evening. It was just to start the conversation related to transition, some of the feedback we're hearing. You know, social media, Facebook, Nextdoor, it can be the best thing in the world, it can be the worst thing in the world. I mean, it's a really good tool for spreading information, but it's also a tool for spreading misinformation. So it's a difficult time to be in this field, because the ability of people to comment on social media it's so easy. You can do it anonymously. It doesn't even have to be anonymously, but it's a reality that we have to deal with.
I think one of the fundamental questions we can ask moving forward is, after a decade of implementing the master plan, we've obtained the results we want, and maybe even better than what we expected in some perspective. Do we actually want to stifle that, or do we want to make small incremental modifications to redirect or maybe the most contentious or the most conflicting parts of the zoning ordinance that can be addressed, but not to completely stifle the success that we've had? And I think that's the fundamental question we need to ask. Do we want to just say, okay, this is way too much, and we want to really cap it and control it, or do we want to ride the wave of success, but look at the areas that are really the most contentious and where sparks fly the most?
Yeah, my opinion as not a planning commission member is we've only scratched the surface on our 3 phone-based districts, Big Beaver, Maple Road, and the Nodes. We've only scratched the surface. There's been some really good things happen. I think that I'd like to continue to let it happen, but maybe tweak. Do I want a 5-story building at every intersection? Absolutely not. Is it appropriate? Maybe at some intersections, maybe. I would not want to see a proliferation of 5-story buildings at the intersections. No way. No way.
But is that what's permitted today in the node?
Yes. Could it fit at an intersection? Yes. Depending which one, how it's designed, how it's placed, et cetera, et cetera. Do I want a proliferation of them at every intersection? No. I don't think it's appropriate. It's too high.
So maybe one approach that we can have moving forward is really dive into those nodes and maybe classify those nodes a little bit better. Put them into 3 categories and restrict some for the 5-story and maybe allow some for the 5-story that really makes sense, that's more appropriate, that has a significant buffer to residential. Instead of just blanketing everyone and saying we're just, regardless of what's there, we'll just put the same restrictions on every corner.
We took an important step about a year ago when we strengthened our design standards across the board, because we really drilled down and talked about transition, and we talked about compatibility.
Right.
And that was important. That helps us to some degree, but there's still that potential for an applicant to really get aggressive. And I still hear people complain about the storage facility on Rochester Road, the 4-story.
Right.
I hear it all the time.
How do we land on 5 stories for the node? And if you don't remember that.
Yeah, it was 11 years ago. Again, I think it was, you have to put the master plan in its context of coming out of the recession and dealing with just disinvestment and wanting to stimulate and coming off the heels of Vision 2020, wanting to create place and wanting to encourage these different types of housing products and mixed use and vertical mixed use. And I think it came from a good place.
It's spurring, yeah.
Yes, it was really intended to incentivize and spur.
So I was asking because, I don't mind that project we've been talking about on the Haldane project is somewhat dense, but I don't have the same view that you have on that project. But if it was 5 stories, is it 3 stories now? If it was 2 additional stories, I think that would clearly be too dense, at least in my
That's what
opinion.
kind of set me back, because when I was told that it could have been, oh, don't worry about the 3, it could have been 5.
And so I'm just wondering if the requirement was then, it's not 5 stories, then 3 stories, would there be the flexibility to approve a 5-story project on an appropriate intersection?
You could be through.
As opposed to
Yeah,
having
through special use,
Yeah.
yeah.
That would be an easy tweak.
So that would make sense to me. Because I
Yeah.
think you get density and then you have the flexibility to have something potentially taller.
Yeah, we've seen some great designs in the city of Troy recently that have been approved and constructed. There's some great designers out there. There could be 5-story development on some of these corners that look amazing and fit
Oh,
great.
I don't
There could be,
disagree. I don't disagree, yeah.
But there could
But
be.
to have that as the blanket,
Yeah.
I think you said that as well, that probably isn't the right
Yeah.
metric.
One quick thought.
Yes.
The Midtown Square project, those are 4-story, I believe, apartments on
On Livernois?
Coolidge and Maple. Midtown Square,
Oh.
where Home Depot and Target.
The southwest corner.
Correct.
No, you're talking about the one that's been there 20 years, that one?
Yeah.
I think those are
Ford
4,
Mullen.
I think they're 3.
There are 3, they kind of just look like 4, maybe because they have a ground floor that's below grade, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But the point is, they don't have residential butting up to it, because it used to be a tractor factory. And besides, the other side's Birmingham, it's not us. But anyway, it's appropriate for that corner, those tall,
Right.
because it's.
It's in the context, right?
Yes, it's in
Yeah.
the context of what's next to it, a shopping area and streets. I mean, it's just, there's nothing really, and a railroad track for that matter. So it fits.
Yeah. But interestingly, I think you may have been on the planning commission, Panera proposed a drive-through on the residential side of that building. And there's a packed house of those residents concerned about the impact on their properties, because those are condominiums.
Yeah.
So, there's still that
Even that has a little tension point.
that friction point.
Yeah.
Stanfield.
Coming back to the driveway for, not driveways, but all the streets in most neighborhoods, you said it was 20 feet wide? 20.
The example that was shown was 22 feet wide, but new streets that are constructed starting today, 28 foot wide.
28, okay. I just want to know, thank you.
Have you gotten the feedback that you needed, or is there more specific?
I think so.
feedback you were
I
looking
think
for?
we've gotten feedback. I think what we'll do is we'll kind of marinate on this and talk internally and come back, if we come back with some little more defined solutions.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe instead of that big red hard line thing, you just take watercolor, just push it across, let it bleed.
Thank you. Okay, so item number 6 on the agenda is a study item on one-family housing options. And Mr. Abahidian, are you gonna lead this conversation?
I think so, maybe I'll let Brent or Ben start it off, or I'll
Sure,
just
baby.
dive right in. Okay.
You run your own.
Sure. So just as a follow-up to the conversation we had 2 weeks ago or a month ago on this topic, I just put together a quick slideshow, quick PowerPoint, just to kind of, again, stimulate more thought. Nothing conclusive this evening, just more thought, more idea about, what can we do to actually incentivize more diverse housing for the diverse demographics that we're having, the shift into demographics that we've seen for the past 5-10 years in the city. So I just wanted to quickly go through these slides, and we can just open it up and have that conversation. So we all know what makes Troy such an amazing city, where so many want to live, work, and play. Not only do we have 80,000 plus residents who call Troy home, but we also have over 100,000 employees who work for the many businesses located in Troy. One thing that we know is that the housing market is changing as the demographics of those who live in Troy and those who want to live in Troy is also changing. The millennials have different housing preferences than a family with 2 or 3 kids. Empty nesters also have unique housing criteria that they're looking for in the marketplace. The main question really for this evening's discussion is how can we effectively incentivize the construction of more diversified homes? We have the 3,200, 3,500 colonials that are being built throughout the city, and we have fewer of the 1,700 or 1,500 square foot ranches or bungalows as new developments. Not too long ago, we actually passed the cluster ordinance, and that was intended at preserving open space, but also at incentivizing the smaller footprint housing. The open space concept really caught on with developers, but not so much the smaller footprint housing. So the main question is really what else can we do to incentivize this housing diversity, and not only for larger developments like we see on the left that we're used to seeing, but even for individual homeowners or property owners that might have a property that they might be empty nesters and they're looking at maybe rebuilding new. They've had a property that's paid off and they want to rebuild something different and tear an old, a 40, 50-year-old home, tear it down and build something different. So we have diverse properties in the city that can actually benefit from some kind of incentive to build smaller. And one of the ideas that is up for discussion really is to incentivize a diverse housing stock that millennials and empty nesters are looking for by allowing certain reductions in the minimum geometric criteria established for R1A through R1C single-family residential districts. So this table really shows the existing geometric requirements and also an example of what can be proposed in terms of reduction in frontage, reduction possibly in definitely in height and definitely in square footage, in side yard setbacks to incentivize those type of housing developments. And this just as an example is a visual representation of kind of what those reductions can possibly look at on a really typical lot in the city. So in R1C we have lots that are required to have 85-foot frontage, and they have a minimum 20-foot side yard combined setback that's required. A developer can put any kind of footprint of a home in on that property right now within those limits of that red dash line we see on the screen right there. But if we actually allow for some kind of flexibility, we can allow a developer that variance in that geometry in terms of possibly frontage or setbacks and incentivize them to actually build smaller and build a smaller footprint and create that incentive by allowing these geometry changes to occur. And we also have, in the city, we also have RT zoning district, which not only allows the construction of attached single-family dwellings, but also single-family homes on lots as narrow as 40 feet. But the way our ordinance is written, it actually almost entirely prohibits the construction of these smaller footprint homes on these lots because of the certain geometric restrictions. Maybe it's time that we revisit these restrictions and see if this could be another tool that we can really use to incentivize a diverse housing in the RT district as well. And that's a visual right there. That slide shows the current zoning on the left that actually allows for a duplex in RT, but what it actually restricts is the footprint of the first floor to only 1,100 square foot per unit, and it really forces that development to go up or restricts a ranch, actually a ranch duplex only to 1,100 square feet. So again, there are different options that we can look at in trying to incentivize even single-family homes in the RT district. So 100 years ago, Big Beaver looked very different, right? It just completely different than what we see today. Troy looked very different than it is today. Troy has gone through some amazing transformations in various aspects of our city, will continue to change, including the housing market. Today, we see a lot of what's being built today is really the typical cookie-cutter home, 3,000, 3,200 square foot home, colonial. We know there's a demand out there for something different, for the diverse demographics that we want and that we want to make Troy, that for people that want to make Troy their home. The main question really, the three main questions that I thought of is what does this diversity in housing really look like in Troy? what is the market out there really asking for or demanding that be built in Troy? And how are we as a city going to align ourselves with the short-term and long-term transformations that are slowly occurring? So that's really all I had, and just kind of open it up for more thoughts, more questions.
Thank you for the presentation and the follow-through to create, and I think it's a good topic. I have a few questions, but maybe the main one, and you touched on it, is do we really know the market demand for these smaller units? And I asked that question because we approved a number of the clusters, right? And I think we had an expectation that there would be some smaller homes in those clusters. And the feedback we're getting is there's no interest. At least that's what I recall the developer saying. There's no interest in those smaller homes. So we have the ability for those to be built, and they're not being built.
I think some of the information that we've heard, some of the feedback that we've heard from some of these projects is that some of these homes are being built, but they're not in the price range that some of the buyers were expecting, right? So the idea is, what other tools are there available that not only can provide this kind of housing stock, but also bring the prices in that price range that would incentivize these developers to build them and would actually incentivize buyers to buy them. You know, I think that's what we've heard, because of when some of these builders come before us and they present these projects and they say that they make a floor plan available that is a 2,000 square foot ranch, the floor plan's available, but when it comes down to the price per square foot, I think that's where the roadblock is for a lot of the buyers. And
I've heard Joe Maniaci say that publicly many times. I can tell you that one of the clusters that the Planning Commission recommended approval of, and it was approved, was Midtown Crossing. It's on Rochester Road, on the west side of Rochester Road, and it was total of 14 units, and they were duplexes, if you recall, and at least half of them are going to be 1,500 square feet. We received the most phone calls for that development than any other development since in the 17 and a half years that I've been here. Our phone rang off the hook at those smaller units.
Because you like them.
Because they like the size and the location. So that's a really small sample size and very much anecdotal evidence, but we got so much feedback. We had probably 30, 35 people call.
I think of one of the projects that is...
But that wasn't incentivized. I mean, what were the dynamics that created that project?
They picked up density bonuses.
So it was a cluster.
It was a cluster. Picked up density bonuses by proposing half of them as 1,500 square foot max.
Okay. So within the cluster ordinance, there
Yes.
I'm sorry.
There's no ratio. There is no required ratio that they have to have.
You're not required to do 1,500 square foot maximums. You're not required to.
You get a bonus, a density bonus for doing it.
Heavily incentivized. Heavily incentivized.
So is there anything that we can do that if you promise that you're going to do smaller units, but you have to do it?
We already allow basically double the density bonus to do it. Double.
You get basically your parallel plan, you get so many units. If you do that many units at 1,500, you can double the number of units you do.
So if your parallel plan says you can do 15 units, you can do 30 units as long as 15 of them were not to exceed 1,500 square feet. I mean, it's a significant.
But you're still giving that flexibility to the developer, but you're not
Yes.
requiring them to make this unit and that unit.
No.
So can we do that legally? That's my question.
Well, we do it now.
Okay.
Yeah, we do it now.
So I guess other development that's coming before us is Willow Grove and Square Lake, right? That's similar. That's pretty much the same thing.
Those are smaller units.
Smaller unit, 1,500, pretty much double the units of what can be on that site. So that's an example of incentivizing it through the cluster ordinance, where they're getting the bonus through the setbacks, right through the open space. That incentive there, plus the units by limiting the square footage, and I think that's one tool. But the question is, what can we have other tools at our disposal that can incentivize development in a different way? Also, not just the larger developments that are 15, 20, 30 units, but somehow something that we allow and we give a tool to existing homeowners that are not large developers, but they also want to stay in Troy, and they might want to redevelop their property, their own personal property, to something smaller. So, you know, there are a lot of scenarios, I think, that we have in the city that could create incentives and could actually create that, allow that in terms of allowing existing homeowners to stay within the city and not leave the city if they have that option.
So conceptually, this could be something that a property owner could pursue if they had one relatively small lot that, I'm just going to make up an example here. So R1D, the minimum required frontage today is 75 feet. Let's say a property owner has a home that's 50 years old, and he or she lives on a 120-foot wide lot, right? And the house is smack dab in the middle of a 120-foot lot. They could demo that house, split the lot in half, and put 2 homes, so long as they were not to exceed 1.5 stories in height and square footage.
Right.
So that could potentially be a lot split application at assessing. It wouldn't come before planning commission. They're splitting one simple lot into 2.
Mm-hmm.
So we wouldn't see it. It would
But
be,
that might require variances. So the question is, how do we incentivize it without variances, right? I think that's can we incentivize that development, because that would streamline the process, because right now that's more of a hurdle, right, for a developer to go before the zoning board and request that variance. That's more of a hurdle to getting those 2
Yeah.
small footprint homes.
so this table is difficult to read because you're trying to put a lot of information on one sheet. I get it, totally get it. But the intent of this would be to not require a variance to do this, to eliminate barriers.
Correct.
So that this is by right. So the quid pro quo is the property owner who now has a lot that's maybe a little bit oversized. I'm speaking of the example of the lot split. It's a slightly oversized lot. So they're able to split it and put 2 smaller homes. So potentially that's an increasing the property value for that person. Because instead of having a development potential of 1 house, the development potential, if this happens, is now 2 homes. So it's a bit of a boon for the property owner who wants to sell his or her house.
Impact on the neighbors, right?
Transition, right?
Just different characteristic of the homes next door to you,
Yeah,
right?
you've got, let's say, 80 homes down the street, and they're all on, let's say, 120-foot wide lots, and all of a sudden somebody splits it in half, and it sticks out like a sore thumb.
So probably, you know, if the restriction probably wouldn't allow a 120 to split in half, so it would allow some kind of a concession, you know, maybe 10, 20 feet on the frontage, not necessarily go from 120 to 60, because that would be a significant impact on the neighborhood. You would be basically going from R1A to R1E type of a scenario.
Do you also see this being used in site condominium projects where you get the 20 unit subdivision? They're going to be able to use the smaller numbers?
I think potentially it could, because right now we're obviously incentivizing it and it's not occurring, right? So you can, kind of the way I see it is a possibility where you might get a development where you get a 5-acre site and 30 units, and then you get half of the units just kind of be your standard, any square footage, any type of development, and then the other half would be really limited to one product, and that would be 1,800 square foot ranches. You know, and that area of that development would be specifically designated to that. And
How does our cluster not already do that?
Because cluster ensures green space, but it doesn't ensure the floor space of the house.
right.
Because I was in that meeting that I think the Mondrian property said that I don't have the customer to sell small house. So that's the problem. That's why I was saying that can we require that, make it a requirement that you have to have 20% of your houses has to be less than 2,000 square feet, 1,800 square feet. Otherwise, we don't get the approval. Otherwise, you know, they will always go for the high-end customers to make more money. You know, that's the problem. Because the green space wise, that's an awesome plan, right? Because you get 20%. I think if you leave certain amount of property vacant, they get 20% more or 10% more housing space?
So that's well explained. So where I have reservations is when people read the paper or they get on Facebook and they're angry, they don't call Carlton and complain. They call the city and they complain, or they go to city council and they complain. Because change, for everyone, change is terrible. For me, for everyone in this room, change is bad. So my concern with this, and first off, the concept of incentivizing these options, I think is great. We need more of them. It just, we could have brought stacks of literature, that recent articles published within the last month that back this up. So that, but without the open space, where we've got residents coming and saying, well, you know, I don't like this, but at least I can buy it because there's 30% open space or there's 40% open space, so I'm getting a bigger buffer. Without the open space, it's a tougher sell, because now it's
Very urban.
it's a density grab,
Right.
or it's we don't have that narrative where it's, but a very important narrative we do have is we need these housing types. We're seriously lacking behind the rest of the country for these housing types. We are. So it's a bit of a sell as well, right?
So, but now, the developer had mentioned, like Carlton said, about the fact that they're available, people don't select them to have that house built for them, because it is more per square foot. So how do we force a developer to put something together that's gonna be less dollars per square foot? I mean, isn't that the issue?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now he happens to be an outstanding builder. He builds a great product. This is the Cadillac of all ranches.
You talking about Mondrian?
Talking about the ranch model that you can go look at on John R. It's fantastic. Could he do it for less per square foot? I suppose he could. But the empty nesters and millennials still want, smaller doesn't mean lower quality.
No, high quality.
That's the next point I wanted to follow up with
Yeah.
you on.
No, it doesn't.
High quality, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's gotta be high
Because
quality.
Yeah.
I was on the internet the other day, because I know they're going to talk about it, and I saw a couple of web page, they have more expensive high-end property, but it's just small.
Right.
Because that if empty nesters, they were worried about climbing stairs and all these things, they want to move to a more nicer, place, but more physically, more, suitable for them, so. And I know personally, because being a planning commissioner, they know, so I have one person came to me, he's a school teacher, retired, saying that, I think we need to look into that, because I don't want to move out of the city of Troy, but then what are you doing for the empty nesters?
I get a telephone call like that per week. It's constant. It really is. There's a glaring need for this.
Right.
My fear is, and I hear the same argument, and it's human nature, and I'm probably the same way. It's everyone thinks it's a good idea until it's next to their house. Then it's not a good idea anymore. We hear that all the time. I have no issue with this, just not next to my house. Put it next to someone else's house, and I'll support it. The perception of having more dense development next to your property it's difficult.
So Brent, maybe you touched on it and I missed it, but what's the difference between the one you said is very successful and you're getting calls on it and the smaller homes are moving, and then the other ones where we're hearing that there's no demand for
One
small
significant difference is their duplexes, so they're common wall.
Okay, that's very different, right?
Yep.
Yeah, got it.
Garage dominated front.
Okay.
Can we allow that
Okay.
in the single-family residential home?
We do only as a cluster, only as part of the cluster.
Okay. Only the cluster.
It gets back to transition to the surrounding
Yeah.
neighbors.
Yeah.
We don't want negative impact.
Remember, clusters also have plenty of public hearing at the planning commission and go to council. So there's input.
A
there's
lot
opportunity.
of
We try to strike that balance.
Yeah.
And I think another significant difference is that what we've seen is the cluster developments that have the duplexes, they're in order to get that bonus, they're limiting the square footage to 1,500, right, or below. Without that restriction, the other developments are providing ranches at 1,900, 2,000 square feet, and they're not getting that bonus. So a ranch is being built on the same size lot virtually as a 3,500 square foot colonial, because it's not getting that bonus of being limited to 1,500 square feet.
And one thought I had was about maybe tweaking the cluster slightly to encourage higher quality materials and interiors and exterior materials. You know, take the Nate Forbes attitude of, you know, build it beautiful. You know, just use high-end materials, lighting, all the best that the world can offer, and then give them some kind of a bonus. And I don't know how you aesthetically regulate that, because it's not as simple as math and square footage. But it's going to be up to the developer to come to us and say, look, I want to sell $1 million homes, but they're only 1,500 square feet. But they are incredible. You walk into there, you feel like you've just, you know, walked into a millionaire, a mansion, but it's not. It's mansion quality, not mansion size. So, and amenities. It may have a small atrium. It may have things in it that you don't find in a home of a typical Troy home. So I guess what it comes down to me is, what kind of vision do we have? Do we want some areas of Troy to be like super high end, but small? Because that, and it may be developer driven, because they're going to say, here's a customer that wants a 1,500 square foot home, but they want to spend $1 million for it. So where's that tipping point where the developer says, yeah, let's buy up some land and make 20 of these? Because then they'll attract like people. I mean, you know how people kind of congregate with like thoughts and like similar ideas. That would create that kind of a zone where I'm happy, small, and really elegant. I don't know if that, I'm just throwing that out there as a suggestion. It's up to the developer, obviously, to come to us and
Some
say,
people would like the duplex, make a duplex like that.
yeah, could be. But I'm just throwing it out as, I've read articles, and thank you for the articles you did send us about small homes recently. Point is, you know, again, you were showing, they gave examples of Amber, and they gave examples in New York City. I can't remember the New York City one was, but I thought it was like 300 square feet for
The micro units.
yeah. For, you know, a monthly cost was like $2,000 for, you know, a closet and a kitchen. But that said, there may be a demand for something in between that extreme and a 1,500 standard. And I'm going to have to drive by and see that Mondrian Ranch. Where is that again?
So in John R., just south of Wells on the east side.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop over and look at it. Is it an open house? Okay, good. I'll definitely stop by then. Thank you.
If you look at them from the street, it's the one far right one, to the far right.
Okay.
So just going back to this drawing again, you know, for discussion purposes, if we look at this, you get a 2,000 square foot ranch footprint identical on two different lots. One's 85 frontage, 175. The side yard setbacks aren't significantly that different, and yet you can still fit that same ranch on a property that is 10 feet more narrow than the 85. You know, so this kind of a scenario, I think, would allow that flexibility and that incentivizing, where you would actually restrict the square footage of the home on the right to limit it at a maximum 2,000. But by doing that, you're actually allowing them to decrease slightly your side yard setbacks. And it's, you know, on paper you can see it, but probably visually it wouldn't necessarily have a significant impact on that neighborhood if you would go anywhere from 85 to 75 or 85 to 77, 78. You know, some you know, the question is what's the right number?
So it's basically, potentially, we're looking at an administrative tool. Maybe it's a housing option, like a cluster option, that allows the planning commission or city council to administratively approve something like this by reducing lot width, frontage, or lot area,
Right.
with the understanding that the unit has to be smaller.
Correct.
to meet market need.
Mhm.
And in the future, so in the future, just one,
Yeah.
so in the future, we come up with a magic number, whatever is we're determined to be small enough. 2,000 square feet, just for argument's sake. In the future, Carlton buys it. 10 years from now, he decides, or 5 years from now, I'm gonna put an addition on my house. No.
Right. Because it would specifically be zoned that would restrict that lot, the same way right now we have, you know, zoning, the node zoning. You're restricting height, you're restricting setback, the same way that can be restricted, right? In terms of ordinance.
And I just want to understand, so is the point here then, would you expect someone to assemble numerous lots and then
No,
build
it
another
could-
house? Or
no,
they would
it
just
could
build
be-
a smaller house?
I think it could
on
be
their-
right, it could be a single home. It wouldn't have to be multiple lots, right? I mean, it could be multiple options, right? I mean, that's
So
just an
I'm-
example of one lot.
The size is the same, what you got up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so I'm missing what you're accomplishing.
Yeah, what's the red dotted line for?
So the red dotted line is the permitted, based on the zoning ordinance, the permitted maximum square, buildable lot area that is allowed, right? So the lot allows, with the setback of 40 feet, the rear yard setback, and it allows like 35% max of your lot. So that, I think the red line right there is just indicating your building envelope by the permitted setbacks. That's what it's really showing.
So
why,
what-
yeah,
Go ahead.
So why on the one on the right, why don't you just make the house slightly narrower and deeper?
Yeah. I mean,
And that way you have 10 foot on both sides.
Right, it could be multiple scenarios. I mean, I do that to show that the exact same footprint, what would it look like if you would reduce your frontage, you know, if it'd be, you want to build the exact same home on a 85 frontage versus a 75 frontage. Right, I mean, there are obviously architecturally, you can modify the floor plan where you can have those.
Same setbacks,
Same
but-
setbacks, correct.
Okay, but on a narrower lot.
So scenarios where this could possibly happen. The person who has a large lot, just larger than is typical. Someone assembles 2 or more parcels to create a larger lot. Or someone assembles numerous parcels, creates a really large lot and does a site condominium development with a street and, so there's 3 different ways potentially that this could be achieved.
So do you think that this is allowed now, that if there are like 3 individual houses, they combine, they want to do something, is it allowed? Or it has to go through the rezoning?
So the next step would be,
Short answer, not now.
not now.
Not now.
Not
You
now.
have to comply with the minimum lot width, which is 85 feet, let's just say for R1C. So if you
Yeah,
do it,
exactly.
right.
So you-
Or Mr. Appidian's would be basically if you have 4 lots that are 85 feet, you may be able to get a 5th lot out of that. I did the math correctly.
But then still,
but
the
then you-
parcel size has to change, there has to,
They'd
it
be
has to go
smaller.
through some
Well,
approval
that-
process, right?
Well, that's what I'm hearing, yes, would be dealt with in some fashion, either through rezoning or through some administrative review process. I'm not hearing consensus from everybody.
Yeah, and I'll object to that, because that happened in my neighborhood, as you know. We had a minimum of 100-foot wide lots, and somebody got away with only 90. And it's through, I mean, it just happens to be personally for me, it used to be my neighbors lined up, our property lines. Now, they're all shifted, and I've got 2 people living behind me now instead of 1. So it's, yeah, it's sort of like, you know, why are we doing that then? You know, is that taking away some of the integrity of that type of neighborhood then, if some of them back up to lots that no longer were that way when they bought the house? So I'm a little bit hesitant about making things, you know, a blanket. Yeah, we can allow this kind of narrowing of the zoning. You know, if it's R1C says 85, I want to see 85.
Yeah, it probably gets back to quality. You know, if you've got someone investing a lot of money in a new home, and then, you know, these smaller units that come in next door need to be significant quality. Because we're talking potentially different massing and scale. So it's probably not one size fits all, but again, there's a need for these units. So, maybe this is something that's appropriate on a major mile road, but not internal, just as an idea. Again, it's your concept, Mr. Abahidi, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud.
Mr. Tarpelli,
Yeah, quick question, coming back to what Mrs. Fowler said. So, could we tell the developer to have more ranch houses, like what Mr. Apahidian said, the same style, but put it to a minimum of the regular houses that we get today? Is there a possibility that the people would buy that house, the ranch houses, because they don't have other places to go if they like Troy lot? Is there a possibility if you enforce that?
Well, what I would say to that is what we could do to be really heavy-handed is if you want to do a cluster, you have to do smaller homes.
So, I thought we've made decisions in the past with the idea of not to be heavy-handed, right?
Mhm.
To build in flexibility so that the developer and the market could determine what's built. So that'd be my feeling, is that we should not mandate or be heavy-handed.
I was just answering the question.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. I was just giving the
How about like if you get like two options? One is the way it is, and then you said, okay, if you make additional smaller homes, then you get additional 2 lots, right? You can.
That's cluster.
We pretty well do that now.
that's a cluster.
Yeah, cluster does.
It's a
No,
cluster.
no, no. What I'm saying is like, you currently like if cluster home is like 20% green space you leave, you get 10% more apartments or houses. That's the
Yes,
way
we
it
have.
is. But then there is no limitation for the floor area because you can make a 4,000 square feet house within that, within the limit. So then that it would, on top of that, you can say if you can give some other additional incentives, like okay, so now if you can have 10% or 15% smaller houses, you don't have to leave 20% green space. You can leave 10% green space. You understand? So there are like 2 things. So that way, there is more incentives to have maybe 2 additional houses in that 10% space that you're getting free.
So there's more houses and less buffer in that cluster potentially. So there's other.
And
but I
then you
understand what
can
you're
always
saying.
change
Right.
20 to
Yeah.
30 and make it 15. We can play with the numbers. So then that's our
Yeah,
decision.
and it's a good suggestion. I think one of the trade-offs that even got the cluster adopted was the fact that for the density bonus, you're getting all this green space and open space and buffer.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
gonna be
not
hard to sell to
many-
go back on that, saying we're gonna allow for more houses and reduce the amount of open space.
So, but how about you said that the 20% number that we have right now is 30%,
So
and then
increase-
make a 15%, so that you eventually, play with the number, and then you are still 20%, but you allow more houses. We can, look into that. That way there will be some incentive, because currently the way it is going on, and I like that you mentioned that in the 10 years, 20 years down the road, those houses will be empty, because there will be no more. But people are not seeing that way. So I think somehow we have to incentivize that effort so that they can make it. That could be one approach. I'm just
I think it'd be really worthwhile to have a builder come in and talk about the market.
Right.
To explain
Yes.
this.
So that, yes.
Because what I've heard, and not just in Troy, and other places, is when you develop property, there's fixed costs,
Right.
land costs, carrying costs, etc. You're really by doing the smaller houses, what you're saving on is a little bit of labor costs and material costs, but you can't make that up
Yeah, of
in
course.
sale price. So buyers come in and they're say looking at a ranch that's a little bit less expensive than a 2-story or larger home. They're going to go with a larger home because the developer can't lower the price enough of the ranch to make it worthwhile. So there's a lot of market that we have to really understand to be able to tailor the correct ordinances to meet
Right.
that demand.
But that 20%, 30%, that number that we have right now, the 20% number that we have right now, we can still keep that 20%. I'm not saying that we are going to lose our green space by applying that other formula. But then we can make some kind of steps, like
I don't disagree with you. I think my point I'm saying is that we've raised that to the developers, and they say, it's not how much open space you require, and it's how much, it's simply the cost of, I don't have buyers that are willing to pay the price I have to,
Right.
the price I have to spend to build a ranch
It's higher.
versus I can build these colonials all day long and sell them at a good price.
Right, now, just to
And
counter
so that's why they're saying you can let us do density all, unlimited. There's just a market limitation on what we can sell those ranges for. It's just not worth it. It's not affordable for us.
But if you
So
have
I
a free
understand.
space, if you have a free space, say the green space, somehow we manage to have like half of that space, because I know that we don't want to go there. That space is free for him or her, the builder, right? He or she can get another house.
But the point is that the cluster trade-off was more density for more open space. That was the direct
Yeah, you don't want to defeat that.
Because what I'm trying to say is, like, if you have even with cluster rule, your houses are not occupying the plots, right? The houses are a lot smaller.
Setbacks.
Because you are looking for, if I look at the current trend, the builders are trying to build 3,500 to 4,000 square feet houses in Troy. They don't make 6,000 square feet house in Troy, or they don't want to build 1,800. But then those cluster properties, the plot sizes are much bigger than that. Somebody may have big backyard, somebody may have small backyard. Builders are not interested in that, even the owners are not interested in the backyard. What they're interested in, what is the size of the house. So what I'm saying is, if you plan it properly, maybe you can have more houses, more green spaces, but still you can enforce some kind of small houses within that green space by kind of stepping in.
Yeah. I like the way you're thinking. You're thinking creatively, and you're looking at the nuance of the cluster. There may be a way to get there through the cluster, but I do hesitate because of the history that we have, and many of us on the planning commission is, we sold the community on a bill of goods, right? Like we had an argument. It was a lengthy process, and it was a bill of goods an argument that we made. And to change that, I'm a little. It would really have to be compelling, and we'd really have to talk about the details and make sure that it was really we were comfortable with this, and we did a really good job.
To take an example and then
Yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah.
And see. Okay.
I'm thinking
that maybe something.
And maybe we take the same approach that you're stating, but we do a different. We create a new option.
Yeah.
And we do something a little bit differently as a new option.
Maybe
So,
the new
question.
option.
Did we model the cluster after something that we saw in another community, or, okay? And so, just
Well, I
carrying that
should
thought-
say that we wrote that based on other ordinances that we have written before, but there were some unique aspects that were tailored specifically to the conditions here in Troy. And part of that was based upon also the woodland protection ordinance. Remember, we passed the woodland ordinance protection first. In order to achieve the goals of woodland protection, we modeled the cluster ordinance kind of to meld with them. So there are some principles that are universal to this ordinance that are standard in all open space clusters, but there are some nuances that are unique to Troy, such as the variable up to 1,500 square feet. I've never seen that anywhere else. The variable of the amount of open space and the density increases based on percentage. That was pretty unique.
Yeah. So where I was going, thank you for that. Where I was going with that is, we're talking about this maybe in a bit of an abstract way. Is there a model, this type of housing is not only in demand in Troy, right? It's all over the country, or all over Michigan, or are there other communities that have ways to tackle this that we can potentially look to as potential examples?
Did you
Get some
research any?
ideas and thoughts.
No, I didn't really look into it that much, but I mean,
But
just
I think-
locally, we're aware of kind of different communities that have a different feel than we do because of their density, which, like, for example, Royal Oak, where Troy's not a Royal Oak. so,
Understood. Understood.
But I think the idea of having another option of some kind of a cluster where it could be a hybrid of what we have now, mixed with some variation of this, where we know the reality is that the demand is the demographics of who's looking for these type of houses exist, right? So the
Yeah,
demand
because
is there.
they're moving into Royal Oak and Birmingham because of it.
So-
They
so
have
the-
it there.
So the question is,
Yeah.
that's not an if the demand is there, but we know it is. So what can we actually do to meet that demand by keeping or attracting new residents to the city? I think that's something that we can still explore, even though it might not look like this, but the question is, what can that look like? You know, that idea shouldn't be abandoned because we know there are buyers out there that want something of a smaller
And
footprint.
that was my point, exploring different alternatives. I wasn't saying abandon
Yeah,
it, but yeah, Mrs. Savna. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, you know Carol Pocadillo.
Yeah.
Well, she moved to Dublin, Ohio, and she's in a development that they're very narrow, deep lots. You drive into a 2 or 3 car garage, and then the house is very long and narrow. And it's a very interesting development, very interesting. They actually did it kind of, all the stone is different, it's kind of Scottish flavor, and kind of winding roads, etc. And when you keep talking about these narrow, deep lots, it just brings me back to that particular development. So I'm going to I'll get the name of that and get it to you. It's very,
Yeah.
very, very attractive development.
Yes.
So, I think there was a consensus when Mr. Abahedian first pitched this idea, there was a consensus that this was something worthy of looking at.
Mhm.
And I think,
Agreed.
based on what I'm hearing and the heads nodding and whatnot, I think there still is consensus that we should investigate what the tools to maybe get us there that aren't negatively impactful on existing neighborhoods. I think Mr. Abahedian's done a really good job of framing the issue and coming up with some ideas. Could staff take a look at, kind of chew on this for a little bit, do some research and kind of scratch our heads over this a little bit and come back with some ideas? Maybe have another conversation?
Yeah, and to Ben's point, would we have a developer in that conversation, or should we consider having?
I think we should
a developer as part of
consider-
that conversation.
I think it needs to be the right person, and we'll talk about who that person may be.
I think that makes perfect sense.
It may be someone who doesn't do a lot of development in the city of Troy.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
interest, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So some benchmarking in other places, especially the builders benchmarking, because I see here all the, local builders, so they may not have that idea. So it could be a new business, so,
Mhm.
as I mentioned, I saw a couple of builders, I was looking for like empty nesters home, and if you go to wherever I'm sure that's something that you are going to do.
Yeah.
That you already mentioned. That'll be something interesting to see as a team.
If anyone's seen some developments, some products, email them to me.
I'll send you an email.
Sounds good.
I think a lot of the developments that I've looked at, the visual is very different because it's a very unique development where the entire development is like Barbara said, it's not necessarily one isolated home in the middle of an existing sub,
It's
where
important.
you can have homes on narrow lots that are 40 foot wide, and the development can look exceptionally well.
Yeah.
Just because it's 40 foot doesn't mean that you can't have a really top-notch quality product that is very attractive and luxury. But that's something that I think we should continue to explore and look into. That it doesn't have to be on 85 foot. It can be a development that's very unique. And similarly, the way we incentivize cluster, it really just took that first development to come through and kind of sparked the interest of the first developer. And then once that came through, everybody just kind of like, wow, actually, this can be done. And we just that just brought on the other development. I think the same way with whatever we're kind of proposing here to incentivize. It's really going to take that first step of that leap of faith for a developer to come in and do something just totally out of the box, and do front page on Troy Times, and that's what it's going to take.
Something
Thank you.
disruptive, yeah. Thank you.
You have what you need on that one? Also, Brent?
I want to thank Mr. Epstein. That was really good work and really got the good conversation started, so thank you for doing that.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Item number 7 on tonight's agenda is public comment for items on the current agenda. Is there anyone that wants to make a comment on an item on tonight's agenda? Yes.
I just like,
I think the microphone so you can get recorded.
I don't know if it is on.
Yeah, it is.
It's recording. A very interesting conversation. A lot of food for thought. But the operative to me is what Mr. Sabanett said about what we might find in 15 years. And so I think you really have, the pressure is on you, and I don't envy you for it. The pressure is on you to come up with the ideas that will support a community after people have left in the droves, because as he said, in 15 years, that's what's going to happen. Or that's what the consensus of thought nationwide, not just here, I guess,
Right.
is. Because, so, thank you for your time and your effort, but not an easy job. And I won't be here to see it. I don't know how many of you will be here to see it, what you do or don't do. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
I'm Suresh Rama. I'm one of the Troy residents for a long time, over 20 years. Very interesting conversation about new development, and I also brought my son Pranav Rama, who's a scout, and he wanted to see a city meeting, so that's him participating and trying to do, so thanks for accommodating us. One of the things that I did not hear, but we started the topic on millennials. I saw the talk gravitate to luxury homes, which could be easily affordable by the empty nesters. Soon going to be one in about 4 years. Don't like to move out of Troy, love to consider that. But what about the millennials who are not going to be at least? We don't have the millennials out of San Francisco in the Bay Area who are already millionaires to retire at 29, but we have a lot of working millennials who are not going to be able to afford those luxury homes, but they cannot afford a 3500 Colonial also. What is the plan to attract them to here to kind of mitigate the wave that we are talking about? In 50 years there's going to be droves leaving there. So without having facilitation for attracting millennials, we can only talk about the droves leaving because we know that is going to happen. So just wanted to see if that could be introduced in your conversations and in the planning part of it.
Okay, thank you. And one of the things, maybe it was in the materials and we didn't talk about it, the two large demographics that we think have the demand for the smaller homes are the empty nesters and the millennials. So, but thank you.
Most of the discussion I heard was
I understand.
going towards the luxury homes and
So
2,000
price
square
point.
foot that is going to be priced per square foot very high, which is not going to be affordable with a millennial.
Right, understood. Thank you.
Just really briefly to comment on that. So the conversation this evening was really two topics. One was transition, and the other was one-family housing options. So the intent of the meeting wasn't to jump into the issue with millennials and with attracting and retaining millennials. The master plan does address this in great detail. I won't go into it, but it is important. We're aware of that issue. We're trying to make steps to become a place to attract and retain millennials. One of the slides that was showing up there was the number of apartments, for example, that we're seeing. I think as we see more and more apartments, supply and demand, the price point will lower, and your point is a good one. And we're aware of it, and I encourage you to review the master plan. And if you need help finding it online, give me a call or an email, and I'll track you to where it is.
Thank you. Item number 8 is Planning Commission comments. I'll start with Mr. Kraft.
Yeah, I'm all set tonight.
Okay, thank you.
I'm good, thank you.
Thanks.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Nothing, thank you.
Just thank you for your input. That was very helpful.
Nothing.
Thanks again, Ollie, for the effort.
Okay. Thank you.
We're adjourned.